so we're going to read the 3 other verses, then go on to the word-by-word synonyms. Veda Gupto Muni Krishno Yatto Hamidam Adyakam Itwa Swa Shishan Palaidin Bhagavan Badarayanaha Moyam Putraya Shantaya Param Guyam Idang Jakau Vichitraviryo Tovaha Kasiraja Sute Balat Swayamvaradupanite Ambika Ambalik Like Hube Tayora Sakta Hritaihu Grihito Yakshmanamritaha. So, word-by-word synonyms. Vichitravirya. Vichitravirya, the son of Shantanu. Cha. And Avarajaha, the younger brother. Namna, by a Gandharva named Chitrangada. Chitrangadaha, Chitrangada. Hataha was killed. Yasyam, in the womb of Sachavati, previous to her marriage to Shantanu. Parasasharat, by the semen of Parashara Muni. Sakshat, directly. Avatirnaha, incarnated. Harehe, of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Kala, expansion. Vedaguptaha, the protector of the Vedas. Munihi, the great sage. Krishnaha, a Krishna Dvaipayana. Yataha, from whom? Aham, I, Shukadev Goswami. Idam, the Srimad Bhagavatam. Adyagam, studied thoroughly. Hitva, rejecting. Swashishyan, his disciples. Paila Adin, headed by Paila. Bhagavan, the incarnation of the Lord. Badarayanaha, Vyasadeva. Mayam, unto me. Putraya, a son. Shantaya, who was truly controlled from sense gratification. Param, the supreme. Guyam, the most confidential. Idam, this Vedic literature. Srimad Bhagavatam. Jagao, instructed. Vichitraviryaha, Vichitravirya. Ata, thereafter. Uvaha, married. Kashiraja Sute, 2 daughters of Kashiraja. Balat, by force. Swayamvarat, from the arena of the Swayamvara. Upanite, being brought. Ambika, Ambalike, Ambika and Ambalika. Ube, both of them. Tayaho, unto them. Asakta, being too attached. Hridayaha, his heart. Grihitaha, being contaminated. Yakshmana, by tuberculosis. Mritaha, he died. So translation, Chitrangada, of whom Vichitravirya was the younger brother, was killed by Gandharva, was also named Chitrangada. Sachavati, before her marriage to Shantanu, gave birth to the master authority of the Vedas, Vyasadeva, known as Krishna Dvaipayana, who was begotten by Parashara Muni. From Vyasadeva, I, Shukadeva Goswami, was born, and from him I studied this great work of literature, Srimad Bhagavatam. The incarnation of Godhead, Vyasadeva rejected his disciples, headed by Pila, instructed Srimad Bhagavatam to me because I was free from all material desires. After Ambika and Ambalika, the two daughters of Kashiraj were taken away by force. Vichitravirya married them, but because he was too attached to these wives, he had a heart attack and died of tuberculosis. Poor guy. Actually, maybe we don't have to do this verse repetitively. So I'm going to read the next verse with its purport, and we're going to talk about these subject matters. Text 25. Kshetre prajasya vibratur matrokto vatarayanaha dhritarashtra cha pandhum cha viduram cha yajejanat. Vatarayana Shri Vyasadeva, following the order of his mother, Satyavati, begot 3 sons, 2 by the womb of Ambika and Ambalika, the 2 wives of his brother Vichitravirya, and the 3rd by Vichitravirya's maidservants. These sons were Dhritarashtra, Pandu, and Vidura. So purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Vichitravirya died of tuberculosis, and his wives Ambika and Ambalika had no issue. Therefore, after Vichitravirya's death, his mother Satyavati, who was also the mother of Vyasadeva, asked Vyasadeva to beget children through the wives of Vichitravirya. In those days, the brother of the husband could beget children through the womb of his sister-in-law. This was known as Devarena Sutotpati. If the husband was somehow unable to beget children, his brother could do so through the womb of his sister-in-law. This Devarena Sutotpati and the sacrifices of Ashvamedha and Gomedha are forbidden in the age of Kali. Ashvamedham Gavalham Bam Sanyasam Palapaichakam Devarena Sutotpatim Kalu Pancha Vivarjayet. In this age of Kali, 5 acts are forbidden: the offering of a horse in sacrifice, the offering of a cow in sacrifice, the acceptance of the order of sannyas, the offering of oblations of flesh to the forefathers, and a man's begetting children in his brother's wife, as from the Brahma Vaivarta Purana. So, a lot of things to talk about. So, Om Ganat Timidandasha Gananjana Shlakaya Chakshur Meditam Yena Tismai Shikadve Namaha. So several subject matters here. One that I found quite interesting, in the first verse we read today, it described that the incarnation of Godhead, Vyasadeva rejected. It's not loud enough. The incarnation of, I think it needs to be louder. Anyway, sorry. The incarnation of Vyasadeva rejected Pila Rishi and his disciples, headed by Pila Rishi. In the Srimad Bhagavatam, it describes that, let's say, Pila Rishi was given charge of the Rig Veda, and the other rishis were given charge of the other Vedic literatures. And so, let's try to unpack this about rejecting. I couldn't find any other references to his rejecting, except for at one point, later on the Srimad Bhagavatam describes how the different sages vomited up the Vedic literatures. But that's not really rejecting. So from this we can understand that when Srila Vyasadeva was sort of chastised by Narada Muni, his spiritual master, for not directly pointing out the direct service of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, then he sort of put aside what his disciples were working on, which is the other Vedic literatures, and even put aside the Mahabharata, because this was after he compiled the Mahabharata, and concentrated on the Srimad Bhagavatam, which is the very essence, the cream of the Vedic literatures. Of course, in the other Vedic literatures, especially the Rig Veda, Atharva Veda, and Yajur Veda, and Samaveda, there are references, it's interesting, and also in the Upanishads, there are references to Krishna as the coward boy who enjoys, and worshipping the coward boys. In the Upanishads you find that. And Srila Prabhupada presented us one particular Upanishad that was actually from, I believe it was from the Atharva Veda, and that's the Ishopanishad. That's the only one of the Upanishads that are in the 4 Vedas. Anyway, so my understanding is that Srila Vyasadeva understood that in Kali Yuga, the presentation of the other Vedas directly was not required, that one should concentrate on Srimad Bhagavatam, which is Krishna Swadharma Upakate, which is where Krishna, or how Krishna manifests himself in this Kali Yuga. So that's my explanation of that. Then we'll get down to the story. So yesterday we told a little bit of this story, and we'll continue. So we also talked about yesterday about the birth of Vyasadeva. Vyasadeva is called Dvaipayana because he was born on an island, and by his father Parashara Muni, and by his mother Satyavati. That story we told yesterday. So what happened in this particular case, in the Srimad, in the Mahabharata, this is a Mahabharata story, is that these girls, that is Amba, Ambika, and Ambalika, to marry his brother Vichitravirya, because Vichitravirya was a little wimpy. We mentioned that he was pretty weak, so he couldn't go to his own Swayamvara, so grandfather Bhishma had to do it. Anyway, so he brought the girls back. We already told the story about grandfather Bhishma and Shikandani and Shikandi yesterday, so we're not going to tell that today. So what's described here is that Vichitravirya basically engaged in sense gratification with his 2 wives. Now, the interesting thing about sense gratification is that sense gratification, particularly in sex life, depletes the energy of the living entity. If one studies the Ayurveda, one will come to the conclusion or to the information that every time the man has sex life and discharges the semen, it's like losing, and I forget how many gallons of blood, maybe someone remembers the exact number.
70 drops is one discharge, 70 drops is one.
Well, gallons, not just 70 drops of blood. It's actually gallons, actually the description, and you've probably heard about the Radha Damodar party.
I can't remember.
But it was a large amount.
Yeah.
It wasn't just 70 drops of blood. It was a lot. And because you got this whole hierarchy when you eat food, and eventually becomes the energy, and eventually goes, the whole hierarchy eventually produces semen. And I don't remember exactly the details, but it's like gallons of blood. In other words, the energy. And Prabhupada said, someone who engages in illicit sex, not unlimited, nobody can be unlimited, except for Krishna. But if one engages in illicit sex, he describes that by the time someone is 40 years old, as Prabhupada said in the statement, that one would wish they were dead because they're losing their brain power, like we see nowadays. So many people develop this Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease, of course, is a disease where you not only forget things, but it changes your whole emotional mentality. In other words, you're getting angry at people. It's very hard. You go for a walk and you don't come back because you forget where your home is. That's Alzheimer's disease. So that's the problem. And so Vichitravirya really was in lust with his 2 wives, and he had too much sense gratification. He was already weak in constitution, as pointed out before, because his brother had to, grandfather Bhishma, or Bhishma at that time, he wasn't grandfather, had to go and find his wives for him. And so then he got tuberculosis. And tuberculosis, Prabhupada also said, is a disease of not eating enough. Prabhupada said diabetes comes from too much eating, and tuberculosis comes from not eating enough. So in other words, his bodily constitution became very weak. He probably was so much engaged in illicit life that he basically he didn't eat too much, or he didn't have enough energy. In other words, a depletion of the bodily energy. And then he had a heart attack and died of tuberculosis. So what happened after that is that Satyavati de facto became in charge of Hastinapur because there was no one else. And grandfather Bhishma had taken the vow of not taking charge of the kingdom. He said he would assist or serve whoever was in charge. So de facto, she became the queen at that particular point and was in charge. And she was very worried about something called succession. We talked about that in a previous class, that succession is very important because that means that someone's mission, the kingdom, can go on. Just like in our International Society of Christian Consciousness, we're talking about succession. That means who can take over when Prabhupada disciples pass away. And it's a very important discussion because right now it's a problem. We don't have people being trained up to sort of take over, and most of us, I guess most of the Prabhupada disciples are in their 60s, some of them are in their 70s, and, give us another 20, 30 years, and it's hasta la vista, we're gone, at least from this material world or this particular birth. So, that's important. So she was very concerned who was going to take over in the future. And she knew that she couldn't be, the future leader of Hastinapura, because what was required at that time was a king who could go out in the battlefield and fight, not simply someone who would sit back in the palace and direct things. So, therefore, she ordered Bhishma, her half-son, not even half-son, stepson, sorry, her stepson, to have a relationship with Ambalika and Ambika, which was the proper thing to do at that particular point. And Bhishma refused, saying that he's taken a vow of lifetime celibacy, and also his descendants are not supposed to become king anyway, because that's the promise he made to Satyavati's father, the fisherman, Matsuraj. All right. So then she revealed to Bhishma that she had a son by her previous encounters with Parashara Muni, and that son was Vyasadeva. She was actually quite embarrassed about that. It's also interesting that practically no one in the Mahabharata story has an ordinary birth. Practically there's so many different types of interaction between the man and the woman, so many different types of birth that we described yesterday. Satyavati was given birth by a fish, even though she was the king's daughter. So anyway, she called for Vyasadeva. Vyasadeva had told his mother, Satyavati, that any time she wanted him, she just had to think of him. That's an obedient son. She just had to think of him, and he would show up. And so she thought of him. He showed up. But as we mentioned yesterday, he showed up pretty disheveled because he had engaged in harsh austerities in the forest, and his hair was quite long. It was matted. And one of the things they did with hair when they were in the forest is they didn't go to the hairdresser. They actually took the sap of the tree and put it in their hair. Lord Ram did that also when he was in the Vanavas stage with Sita Devi. Sita Devi didn't do that. She actually kept her long hair. But so Vyasadeva, he looked pretty disheveled and pretty gaunt because he hadn't been eating that much, and he was gaunt. Gaunt means like really skinny, cheeks that are sunken in, and hair disheveled, eyes like, when you don't eat enough, the eyes sort of like bulge out like that. And his mother said, all right, you have to have a relationship with these two girls. And he said to his mother, give me a year, Mataji, because if I do it right now, it's going to have very bad results. Also, he was able to predict the future. So he said, it's going to have very bad results. I am not at all attractive. Give me a year. And after that year, eat nicely, take care of my body, and I'll look nice so the girls will be happy with it. Okay. So she said, no. Right now, I'm your mother. You got to listen to me. He said, okay. I told you what's going to happen, but you are so determined. we will do it. So then she went and spoke to the two girls who had not at that point seen Srila Vyasadeva. She said to the two girls, Vichitravirya's brother, who's a great sage, is coming, and he's going to give you children. So they pictured in their minds, this heroic man. He's a sage, but, he's really handsome and everything like that, because many sages were handsome. So they had this whole picture, and they were just like thinking, well, okay, sounds like a good idea. And so the first one, Amba, prepared her bedroom, prepared herself and everything like that, and waited for Vyasadeva to come in. And so she was thinking in her mind, this is described in the Mahabharata, actually, I'm not just making this up. She was thinking in her mind, wow, this great heroic man, sage, is coming in. And so he walks into her room, and she takes one look at him. He looks like, a forest person. Like we said, gaunt and, hair messed up like that. And wild. Like a wild man of Borneo or something like that. And so he walks in, and she goes, ah! And she's so scared. It's scary, frightening. Even if someone like that walked in the door here, I'd be scared. Wouldn't you? I walked in, oh my God. Mahaprabhu, please take him out, So anyway, she closed her eyes. Ah! And, somehow they had a relationship, and as a result, Dhritarashtra was born. And blind child. And of course the blind child couldn't be the next king because the child had to have, or the king has to be able to see to fight in the battlefield. You can't fight if you can't see. That's a no-brainer. So then that information was given to Ambalika, her younger sister. Don't close your eyes. Whatever you do, don't close your eyes. So Vyasadeva walks into her room, and she has a similar response, but she's got the instruction from her sister not to close her eyes. And what happens is she instead turns white. Just like all the blood rushes out of her face. And she forces her eyes to stay open like that, somehow or other. And then she has a relationship with Vyasadeva, and as a result, Pandu was born, Pandu white. And he's, extremely white, and also a little sickly at the same time. So anyway, Pandu was born, and Satyavati, not wanting to take any chances that there's not going to be another candidate to be the king, because she knows Pandu was actually very weak, she says to Ambika, and that's the older of the two. Of course, the oldest was Amba, but Amba was already out of the picture, performing austerities, so she could take birth to kill Bhishma in the next life. So she says to Amba, you got to go forward again. Ambika, you got to go forward again. Have another relationship with Vyasadeva. And she's thinking, no way am I going to do this. It's disgusting. You just can't do it. And so what she does is in her bedroom, she has a talk with the maidservant of actually her husband, which is her maidservant also. So she has a talk with the maidservant and says to the maidservant, look, you sit here on the bed, it's dark, like that, and I'm going somewhere else. I'm not having anything to do with this. So Vyasadeva walks in, and this maidservant happens to be a pure devotee of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, even though she's a maidservant. And she not only is happy that Vyasadeva is there, but she receives him, washes his feet, sweet words, puts a garland on him. Vyasadeva is very pleased. They have a relationship. And Vyasadeva leaves the situation telling his mother that the child that will be born of this particular intercourse is going to be, the greatest intelligent man of this age. And of course, he can't become the king because there's this whole rule of primogeniture. That means the firstborn of the previous king, or at least of someone in the caste who is, Brahmana or a Kshatriya, can become the king. So he becomes the prime minister. And so he's the prime minister of Dhritarashtra and Pandu. So that's the story there. And let's see, the final thing is Ashramedam Gavalambam. So different things are forbidden in this age of Kali. And one thing is interesting, of course, we already know about Ashramedha and one having children and his brother's wife, with his brother's wife. But sannyasam pala vaitrakam. So that sannyas is also forbidden in Kali Yuga. Now, why would sannyas be forbidden, and why do we have sannyas? It's an interesting question. Because sannyas is forbidden because in Kali Yuga, people are mandasumanda mantayo mandabhagya patrata. People are unfortunate, short-lived, less intelligent, and therefore, being less intelligent, when people are given a position, it goes to their head. And when it goes to their head, guess what? They become, instead of nadanam, najanam, nasundarim, kavidamba, jagadisha kamaye, they become attached to dhanam, janam, sundari, attached to women and followers and money and all those other things like that. And actually it even says in Kali Yuga, the grahastas will come begging to the sannyasis for money. There's that particular statement, which is really against the Dharma. The sannyasi said, Maharaj, my wife needs a baby carriage. Can you give us a donation? So, actually you see sometimes the sannyasis have to pay for the gurukulas in Kali Yuga. That's another issue. So anyway, so that's why it's forbidden, except in the case where someone can engage in preaching Krishna consciousness, where it's actually helpful for preaching. Otherwise, it should not be there. A sannyas, or the taking of sannyas in Kali Yuga, does not make one Krishna conscious. In fact, Prabhupada said taking sannyas is like declaring war on the illusory energy, something you don't want to do. Imagine going to Durga. Sometimes in India, many people worship Durga, and saying to Durga, I declare war on you. It's a very dangerous procedure. So therefore, one has to be engaged in preaching Krishna consciousness in order to overcome the natural tendency for profit, adoration, distinction, which is actually subtle sex life. Just like we see so many religious leaders, and we're not just talking about in Krishna consciousness or the Vedic tradition, but so many religious leaders around the world, when they get a particular position, they actually succumb to this profit, adoration, distinction. And there's so many different scandals that have occurred in America, isn't it? Jim and Tammy Faye, anyway, shouldn't mention their names. And they were very sincere souls when they started. I'm sure they were sincere. They wanted to worship God. They opened their churches and everything like that. But as soon as there's that money and opulence and everything like that, that contaminates the mind. So one has to be very careful in Kali Yuga, especially when one is in the sannyasa order, to be very, very strict in sadhana, and also dedicated to spreading the movement and preaching Krishna consciousness. Otherwise, it's not required. Simply to go to Govardhan and sit down, or simply to go to Radhakunda and sit down and be in Babaji, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. I have so many stories I can tell about things that happened with people who were at Radhakund and what they did with their so-called disciples. And these are not nice stories. So therefore, that's why it's forbidden. But as an emergency endeavor, to actually spread Krishna consciousness, then it can be accepted, but it is only for preaching Krishna consciousness. And Prabhupada explained that. And also Prabhupada said, Mayavad sannyas, another way Prabhupada explained it is Mayavad sannyas in Kali Yuga is forbidden. But Vaishnava sannyas always means preaching. Kali Kalera Dhamma Krishna Nama Sankirtan Krishna Shakti Vinanahe Tarivavartana, as stated in the Chaitanya Charitamrita. That in the age of Kali, there is one Ekon Dharma, and that's Krishna Nam Sankirtan, that's preaching. You understand? That is the Dharma of Kali Yuga. So in that case, if one is following the Dharma of Kali Yuga, then one can take sannyas. Although, another point, Bhaktivinoda Thakur said the preferable stage of renunciation is what's called Kshetra sannyas, where one remains with the family and preaches Krishna consciousness. So the whole point is to accept everything that's favorable. Utility is the principle, as Srila Prabhupada stated. To do what's favorable for preaching. And for many people in the West, it's favorable to remain as a grahastha. You preach in your grahastha life. That's more favorable, especially dealing with Westerners, than being a sannyasi. And in India, of course, right now it's more favorable to be a sannyasi because people naturally respect sannyasis and listen to them. So these are some of the points. So any questions or comments about any of these points? Yes?
I looked up the ratio, 40 to 1.
40 to 1, yeah.
So if you have an ounce, it's 40 ounces. That's
40 ounces,
a little
yeah.
over a gallon to an ounce.
Yeah. In other words, it really depletes the energy of the body. And I remember when I had blood, actually I just recently had blood taken out. Wasn't a vampire, it was for blood tests in Germany. And they just took out a few little vials, I think 3 vials or something like that, little test tubes. And I felt very weak afterwards. I had to just rest for a while. Just 3 or 4 vials of blood. So one is engaged in this illicit life, 1, 2, 3 times a day. Can you imagine what it does to the energy of the body? What's called the ojas, and that's the word I was looking for.
Yeah.
The ojas. You can imagine. So, anyway, poor Vichitravirya, he made a mistake. Yes?
Yeah, I grew up in this knowledge on a different level because growing up, I grew up in a boxing town, and they were told, the boxers were told by their teacher not to have, sex with their girlfriend until after the fight. 2 weeks prior to it.
Really?
Because you lose your energy.
We should all remember that.
That's among the old sportsmen.
Really?
Yeah. That's there for 20 years now. So.
I didn't know that because I never played sports, but I'm a sannyasi, so it's not a problem. So, that's a good point.
Yeah. So I learned it younger, but I figured, well, okay, but that's just for them. But now hearing the way you fine-tuned this information, which
Yeah.
they didn't tell me growing up. They said if you're a boxer, you can't have sex with a girl until after the fight. 2 weeks prior to it, you can't.
Then you could fight her. Anyway, so.
I said, oh, okay, well, okay.
Wow.
It was just common knowledge then, but now we know.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Right? So, for all of you romantic people out there, some information. Out there in internet land, that's some information for you. Yeah. So anyway, the Ayurveda is bona fide. It's bona fide. It talks about, actually, there's a whole hierarchy of different things you get from eating, and I don't remember it right now. You eat, it's transformed into blood is transformed to this, and it becomes ojas finally. So you can look that up, and maybe I'll look it up today. So
Some of the dark arts also, right, like kundalinis and
yeah.
Some of them, it's not just Vedic, for becoming Krishna conscious.
It's not just Vedic for becoming Krishna conscious. You want to talk about
You've got, these different types of, kundalini or other kinds of yoga also understand that. It's a mechanical thing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a physical physiological thing. It's not just like up there in the stratosphere. Good to know. Okay. So, we should all become sannyasis and celibate. So, any other questions? Oh my God. Yeah?
Something off this
Let's get another subject matter right now.
Would you also say that by taking a practice of Krishna consciousness, that we're also, would it also be true that we're establishing war against Maya?
More what?
War against Maya? Or
Yeah. Actually, it is war against Maya, but when one takes sannyas, it's a double war against Maya. Prabhupada actually said that in regard to sannyas. Yeah, sure. When one takes a vow, becomes Krishna conscious, of war again, it's like declaring war on Maya, so you've got to really take shelter of the holy names all the time. Like Prabhupada said, you've got to be chanting all the time. I mean, when I'm doing my deity worship, I'm either listening to a class or chanting, or even when I'm taking a shower in the morning, I'm chanting. You should chant 24 hours a day, Kirtaniyasat Hari, and that protects it, because the mind is so wild. Chanchalangi Manaha Krishna Pramati Balabhadradam Tajaham Nigraham Manye. By or Eva Shirushkam, the mind is restless, turbulent, obstinate, and very strong. This is actually Arjuna's statement to Krishna in the 6th chapter of the Gita. And anything the mind concentrates on or contemplates can steal away the mind of even the most intelligent person, Krishna also says. And then we have Jayato Vishakpum Sango Station Vajayate. So the mind can contemplate things. And then you get so attached, there's no way you can give it up. Okay, on that happy note. Oh my God.
Can you class tomorrow?